Thank you for tuning in to the Practical Preservation Podcast. Please take a moment to visit our website, practicalpreservationservices.com, for additional information and tips to help you restore your historical home. If you've not done so, please subscribe to us on iTunes, Stitcher, or SoundCloud, and also like us on Facebook. Welcome to the Practical Preservation Podcast, hosted by Danielle and Jonathan Kepperling. Kepperling Preservation Services is a family-owned business based in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, dedicated to the preservation of our built architectural history for today's use as well as future generations. Our weekly podcast provides you with expert advice specific to the unique needs of renovating a historic home, educating by sharing our From the Trenches preservation knowledge and our guests' expertise, balancing modern needs while maintaining the historical significance, character, and beauty of your period home.
Today on the Practical Preservation Podcast, we have Rese Oestreicher with us from, what is the name of your company?
It's just known as Rese Oestreicher Architectural Paint Research.
Okay, very good. Thank you. So tell me a little bit about your background.
I'm Canadian by birth and raised in Canada. And I did a fine art course in Canada at a university. And when I decided that what I really wanted to do was go into historic building conservation, there was no course in Canada. So it was a choice between either going to the States, to New York, or to come to London. And I lived here in London briefly as a child, so it felt more of an adventure. So I came over here, and then I graduated, got a job in local government, working with historic buildings and legislation, and eventually retrained at the Victoria and Albert Museum to do specifically architectural paint research.
Okay. And what took you from your fine art background into preservation?
Well, I suppose a realization I was never going to be a great 20th century artist. And also realization is that not really where my passion lay. It lay with historic buildings. But it took me a long time to realize that, because I think if I'd grown up in England, it's an avenue that people go down.
Right.
People go out on their Sunday to National Trust properties. It's very much part of the culture, but less so in Canada. So actually, it was a friend when I realized I wasn't going to go forward with what at that point was sculpture. A friend of mine turned around and said, "Well, you've always liked old buildings. Why don't you do something with that?" And it was, penny dropping moment.
Yeah.
But certainly in this country, people come from all different avenues. I mean, we have architects, we have architectural historians, people who were sculptors, and everyone brings something slightly different to the table, which is very useful. But there isn't, because there's a few of us, there isn't like one path that we've all gone down.
Yeah. And doing the podcast over the past few years, this is one of my typical questions. I've noticed that most people do not have a straight path into historic preservation. A lot of people do have art backgrounds, but there's a lot of different ways that people get into it. But then they find their passion, and they are happier because they have found it. So tell me about architectural paint research.
Well, it's a recognized field of conservation. I think of it more as archaeology, in that you're working with the evidence which the building contains itself. And we use a lot of the same methods that were developed for archaeology and developed also for painting conservation, where we're going into the building, we're taking very small samples that of all the decoration down to the substrate, and we're comparing those with the history of the building and trying to build up an idea of how a room or a series of rooms developed both physically and decoratively.
When you do that, then do you use, do you use computers to run like the analysis, or is it mostly like microscopes, or how do you?
Yeah, I mean, the process is you do architectural the history beforehand, so you know when you arrive on site, you know the building history and its development line. You then take the samples, you bring them back to the studio. They're set in resin, and then their cross sections are made by polishing them. Okay. So if you think of it as a sandwich, you cut the sandwich in half, and you get the lettuce into it. And just as in archaeology, if you find a Roman coin from 56 AD in a particular strata, you know that everything in that strata is from, approximately that date or later. Right. We have pigments in architectural paint research, and many pigments have dates of introduction. Yeah. So French ultramarine, 1828. You know that everything, if you find that in a paint mixture, it's not going to be earlier than that date. Right. And then you cross-reference with the architectural history, and in 1846 there was a marriage. Right. It tends to be births, marriage, purchase. And if
people really, update, right?
Yeah, if you're really, really lucky, you're at a country house and they have excellent records, right. Bills of trade, etc., or description. Horace Walpole was, in the room and described in his diary that it was a shocking blue. You've got a sea of different cream decorations and one blue, and you can, start to make those connections.
Right. Yes. Well, that sounds very, very interesting to me. Do you, is that your primary service, or do you offer other services with your paint research?
No, I think I'm fully capable of doing the historical research myself, but I suppose just the reality of the market is that an organization like Historic World Palaces will have architectural historians on board already, so I tend to not do that. I do if for instance it's the analysis is done because they want to re-represent the room. There's a re-representation. It's not good enough for me to say, oh, that was a warm blue followed by with white moldings. It's often very useful for me to come back on site once I know the stratigraphy pattern of decoration and go back to a specific scheme that the client's interested in, uncover it. And because I know the materials used, I know how they will have decayed over time. Right. So if it's a light paint with in linseed and then was varnished, I will understand that it will have darkened over time. But so when I color match, I will take that into consideration.
And then do you color match then with a modern paint, or do you typically recommend like a historic paint?
Well, that's a minefield. I color match in artist acrylics because it's very fast drying, and I might be on a building site with an awful lot of dust, and I'm perched up on a scaffold, and I need them to dry before I go home. Right. And then the reason I'm using artist quality is we're hoping that they don't fade over time, because they themselves become a document that goes into the history of the building. Then the next step is there are a few paint shops that have very sophisticated photospectrometers that can take a reading of my swatch of color, put that reading into a paint matching, paint producing machine, and out come the paint. And that's a very specific paint. And so for an organization like Historic Royal Palaces or the National Trust, they will go to those lengths in order that they've got a very bespoke color, which was applied in 1845.
Right.
Other projects where there might be, I've been working on a Napoleonic fort, which is perched up on a hill in Cornwall, and is just going to get a complete battering. And they know that from the wind and the rain and the sun, and they know that they're going to be redecorating every 3 years.
Right.
So I've actually matched it to a RAL colors, which is very easy. They can go to any paint shop in the land, and they can have the paint reproduced.
Yeah,
and so within modern finishes, you're trying to find a finish that will echo a traditional lead-based paint. Mm-hmm. So you'd probably go more towards an eggshell. Right. And we're very lucky in Britain. We have people that can produce lime wash, that produce distempers, and they know how to apply it to the building.
Yeah, that is, and the finishes are such a that's very important to have, like you don't want the glossy, you don't want, that's a struggle because a lot of the modern paints are, and so I'm glad that you mentioned that. And you've mentioned some of your notable projects. Are there any that you'd like to discuss or to share?
Probably the most exciting for me personally was William Morris's Red House, which I worked on for over a 10-11 year period. It was William Morris's marital home, and he moved in the 1860s. He stayed there for a very short period of time, but he would have his friends down, people like Edward Burne-Jones and Rossetti and Lizzie Siddle. They would come down and they would paint the walls. And so we were able to, along with the wall painting conservator and various other people like the curator, uncover some of the original decoration wall murals. And that was really exciting.
Oh, that is.
Yeah. So that's great because that's a sense of discovery.
Yeah.
Other buildings are always fun working with the National Trust, I suppose, because philosophically we're on the same level. Historic Royal Palaces as well. They are willing to go that extra mile to have accurate conservation, and they themselves are incredibly knowledgeable.
That it's always nice when you have a client that like appreciates what you're doing and like understands it. Not they're not just upset that it's not going as fast as they think it should.
Yeah. Well, I was on site last week at a Victorian market hall in a Welsh town, and because I love working with metalwork, absolutely adore. I have no understanding why, but I just love Victorian market hall. To me is just very, very happy experience. But the project manager turned to me and said, "Oh, this is just a box ticking exercise." And your heart just sinks. You think, "Oh, I'm still going to do a professional job, but I don't think anyone's going to read this."
Oh,
the council had asked him to do it.
Yeah.
So maybe someone at the council will read it and they'll file it, and people will know that about the building.
They'll at least have that history. So I noticed when I was preparing for our conversation today that you have written for numerous publications and topics. Can you tell me a little bit about that?
Well, I lecture as well, but I think that architectural paint research is quite an obscure, specialized field. So very often I'm actually talking about what exactly it is, or writing about, how this can be a very useful tool to the conservator. Or I'll do more specific articles about graining techniques in the 19th century and how they change from the 18th and the 17th century, because their visual appearance was radically different as we go through time.
Right.
And materials probably changed less, other than more pigments were introduced. But they were trying to achieve very different things in the 17th century than they were in the mid 19th century.
Visually,
Because in the 17th century it was more like an impression of wood, and some of the finishes are just wild. I mean, they're very freewheeling and elaborate. Well, in the 19th century, they were trying to reproduce the wood very often
to make it look like wood.
To make it look like wood.
Yeah. That's very interesting. That's something that I don't know a lot about. I've seen different gradings, and some, I mean, if it's good, it's hard to tell the difference.
Yeah.
So what are some of the common mistakes that you've seen that people make when choosing historic paint colors?
I think we have to make this division between what's an historic color and what's an historic paint.
Okay.
An historic paint, if it's an oil paint and it's the 18th century, is most likely a linseed, lead-based paint, linseed oil. And it's toxic.
Right.
And not only that, it's been banned in Europe. England has an exemption for grade 2 star and grade 1 listed buildings, so the finest buildings. However, there's new health and safety legislation that came in a few years ago that make it almost impossible for the manufacturer to supply it. So that, or you're using a distemper, or you're using a lime wash. And they have very different finishes and very different appearances. So lead-based oil paint's been taken out of the picture.
Right.
If you're using a modern equivalent, you need to find a finish that will most closely replicate that. And if you're looking at a cross section and it's an oil paint, or recently a project, it was a distemper for a nursery, but then they covered it in varnish because they've got little tiny hands. Right. So they're going to muck it up. So that is an unusual finish, but you would want to start with a very, very matte emulsion if you're not going to go down the distemper route. And then you're going to create quite a high gloss finish by adding varnish. So I think that's as important as color, because when you walk into a restored interior, it has to feel right. It's never going to be the same if you're not using exactly the same materials. But a lot of those materials we don't want to use anymore.
Right. That's very true. Was the varnish also applied to make it shinier for like low light, like when we were just using candlelight? Was that also another, or was that not? Was it more just to protect?
In this particular instance, I think it was more a sanitary thing. It was a series. It was a series of a nursery wing, which was south facing. So I don't think it was in that instance issue. I think for reflection of light, gilding was used, and you find a lot of gilding in theaters. Because, of course, in 18th century theater, the audience is as illuminated as the stage. Because everything is by candlelight.
I never even thought about that. That's very true.
So, and then you might use a lighter paint as well, which is going to reflect the paint
more.
I think varnish also helps to give depth, and that's why you find it in graining.
That make it pop out. So what trends or challenges do you see in preservation?
Well, I think probably the greatest threat to preservation is too much money. In that when I work in an area like Mayfair in London, everyone has to have an internal lift and a swimming pool in the basement. And we could be talking about early Georgian buildings.
Oh my goodness.
So that's probably the greatest destroyer in my view. I've walked into 18th century buildings in Chinatown, which until the 1950s were, used more or less as bordellos, and no one was concerned about the decoration.
Right.
You find more original joinery there than you would over generations of upgrades.
Yeah.
I think if you're working in historic interiors, you're fighting that battle for the interior to be recognized as important rather than facade retention and everything behind it goes.
Yeah, there's a neighborhood in Philadelphia right around Independence Hall, that it's from that time period, like mid 1700s to the early 1800s, and it's protected as a historic district, so the facades are all protected, but the insides have all been gutted. I mean, we worked on a house on one street, and it was the only street that still it was the only house on that street that still had its original interior. And
was it given any particular protection?
No, the people bought it 50 years ago and just never wanted to change it, and all the other houses around them had been sold in that time and just got it. So yeah, I think that is a problem, because I think you lose, you retain the exterior, but you lose the historic value when you rip out all the historic fabric.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And also, sometimes it's not even historic fabric. You're losing the plan form of the house.
Oh, that's also true. Yeah.
And once you lose the plan form, the way it's laid out, you lose a lot of the social history.
Yeah. That's very true. Yeah, because in these houses, the kitchens were all in the basement. Well, most people don't want to go down to the kitchen or go down the basement to cook now. So, that's all changing. Yeah, so I definitely, yeah. Yes. So did you have any offers for our listeners? Or you said you do lectures. Are you doing anything?
No, not doing anything at the moment. I'm listening to a lot of lectures on Zoom. And I'll do a plug. I belong to Institute of Conservation, the Historic Interior section, and we'll be having a series of lectures coming up. It's all on the ICON, as it's called, website in England, and we'll be talking about Clarendon, which is a National Trust property that burned down, and how the National Trust is going to approach its conservation when they've lost the core of the house. And then we're going to have, in the following year, a conference on historic libraries, which is a topic which is often overlooked.
Well, very good. I will make sure that those are listed on our webpage where the podcast lives. So how can our listeners contact you?
Well, I've got a website, which is www.historicpaint.com. And another fantastic portal, if you like, into conservation in Britain is something called the Building Conservation Directory. And it's got a website, which is buildingconservation.com.
Okay.
And there you will find all the craftspeople that work in conservation in Britain, as well as all the schools, the educational institutions, and upcoming events on the website. It is printed in physical form. There's something called the directory, but all that information is replicated on the website.
Okay, well, thank you. Thank you so much for sharing your knowledge with me today. I feel like I learned something, and I hope that you enjoyed our conversation also.
Oh, I did. Yes.
Thank you very much.
Well, thank you for having me.
Thanks for listening to the Practical Preservation Podcast. The resources discussed during this episode are on our website at practicalpreservationservices.com/podcast. If you received value from this episode and know someone else that will get value from it as well, please share it with them. Join us next week for another episode of the Practical Preservation Podcast. For more information on restoring your historic home, visit practicalpreservationservices.com.